Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Hey.
It's good to see you.
I'm feeling rested. I had a bunch of fruits and vegetables.
We're going to talk about, as you're alluding to, the correlation between diet and fatigue, specifically something called physiologic fatigue, which is new to me. So I'm excited to learn a bit of things here. Let's do a little background. What are we talking about? Diet, fatigue. Give us a little bit of the context.
Yeah, hopefully some insight into how a healthy diet can help with these feelings of having more energy, recovery, and even performance, really. You know, when I first came up with the 800-gram challenge, the early adopters were mostly CrossFitters. And some people did report that they lost weight, but the overwhelming response that I heard from people felt like they just had more energy throughout the day, more energy for their workouts, which also means that they're recovering faster. Because honestly, the best way to measure recovery is your performance, not, some recovery metric, as we've discussed before. But it came back around because right now I'm running an 800-gram challenge group with my good friends at Street Parking, and a couple people had mentioned, oh, wow, I feel like I have much more energy and more energy in my workouts, which I think they found was like a nice, pleasant surprise. And so I was like, yeah, I think it is an overlooked aspect of the 800-gram challenge. I think, we often are thinking about so much nutrition related to weight or even health, like, okay, get these nutrients for bone density or whatever it is. But we can often overlook why something like the 800-gram challenge can also help from a fitness perspective.
Yeah, and I like that especially because, as you just alluded to, there's this long-term view that we need to take about health or nutrition or weight loss or even performance to a degree. It's like, okay, I'm going to do all these things now in the hopes that somewhere down there I can get all these things. Whereas energy or a lack of fatigue, however you want to look at it, is within a week or within 2 weeks of putting these practices into place, you can start to feel it. So often we try to push away like the short-term gains of things because we're supposed to suffer. But like, this is a short-term gain. That's good.
It's true. It is probably the early win of the 800-gram challenge.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple early wins of the 800-gram challenge. I think there's one, the mental freedom, which in some ways might also be fatigue. Yep. But in some ways, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have to restrict all this stuff. It flips the script on dieting. There's that as an early win. But yeah, you're right. The other early win here is that people feel better.
Cool. So let's dive into the idea of fatigue. Give us a little sense of what that even means.
Yeah, we can really classify fatigue. I'm not a fatigue expert, but kind of three broad categories for fatigue. One is this physiologic fatigue, one is chronic fatigue, and then another one is fatigue secondary to another medical condition. And so I want to be clear that this podcast is not about the latter two, right? So we're not talking about chronic fatigue, which would be fatigue lasting for longer than 6 months. And then when chronic fatigue shows up in something like chronic fatigue syndrome, or fatigue is even part of fibromyalgia, there's going to be other symptoms that people have to help with that diagnosis beyond this 6-month fatigue. And then, of course, there's also fatigue secondary to a medical condition. Cancer is a really obvious example here. All of the treatments and the cocktails necessary to get people through treatment, a big side effect for that is fatigue. What we are talking about, as you mentioned, is this physiologic fatigue. And I think what's interesting, I saw this article by the American Academy of Family Physicians, is that men and women typically describe fatigue differently. Men tend to report it as more feeling tired, where women tend to report it more along the lines of anxiety and depression. It kind of brought up a good point because we do need to distinguish, I think, the feelings of being tired or sleepy versus what would fatigue be. If you are tired, then sleep is going to be restorative. So if all you needed was a nap or greater sleep at night, then when you have a nap or greater sleep at night, you feel better. Where fatigue is something like the sleep is not actually restorative. You don't actually feel better or have restorative sleep when you go to sleep. So that's kind of a distinguish there. Physiologic fatigue could be the result of diet, as we will discuss, but it also could be muscle fatigue. And I think sometimes too, people will just use the word fatigue when they mean tired. So I think sometimes thinking, as much as I want people to use diet as a lever, I think with our busy lives, we also just have to make sure that we consider some of these other factors. Like maybe I'm saying fatigue, but really, am I just missing out on some sleep? Am I getting that 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night that I need? Or maybe I just feel really fatigued because I had a very long, draining workout. Maybe I'm feeling fatigued because I had a really busy day at the office, or because I have 2 small children running the house or running around the house or something like that. Again, I'm all into the diet stuff that we'll discuss, but there's no amount of strawberries that are going to fix 5 hours of sleep a night, unfortunately.
I like that you just misspoke and said 2 young kids running the house. You fixed it,
right.
But you weren't wrong the first time. It can sometimes feel like they are in fact running the house.
They are in fact running the house.
Okay, so let's focus on the strawberries and
right.
the other fruits and vegetables. How might they be helping with this idea of physiological fatigue?
Yeah. So when we create energy in our body for our muscles to contract and produce motion, whether or not it's the running, the squats, the pull-ups, whatever it is, the energy is produced from the breakdown of macronutrients, protein, carb, and fat. So protein, carb, and fat basically get broken down into energy plus water and carbon dioxide. Now, in the process of those breakdown reactions occurring, micronutrients are also used to let those chemical reactions kind of proceed forward. So we've got the B vitamins, of which there are 8. They're particularly well known in helping these chemical reactions create the energy we need for our pull-ups and running. And this is often why, if you've ever stopped and gotten like an energy drink at the gas station or something like that, you'll often see proudly displayed on the front, B vitamins, and it's because they are involved in this energy production. But you don't just need B vitamins. You also need vitamin C, and there's also minerals involved like iron and magnesium and zinc and more than that too. And the thing is, they aren't broken down like macronutrients. So macronutrients truly do transform into kind of carbon dioxide and water, where the micronutrients are just used in the process. You want to think about it as in this process of creating energy, it's almost like a recipe. We need all of these different ingredients there. Yeah, we need the macros, as I've discussed, but then we also need this slew of micronutrients. And you're only going to make as much in the recipe or as much energy as what you have for the least amount of the ingredient that's available. So let's just say that you're making an apple pie and you've got the pie crust and the flour and the cinnamon and sugar, and then you just have 1 apple. Okay, Your pie is going to be kind of small. And so you want to think about energy production in the same way, that you could be limited by the macronutrients. That doesn't tend to be the case in our modern food environment, but you also could be limited by the micronutrients, one of them out of the multitude that are needed. And so this is where people might not be consuming an optimal amount of them, especially for something like their training, that maybe they're consuming enough for basic function, that we're not seeing any obvious symptoms, but maybe for them to produce energy or energy at a rapid rate, that they aren't consuming enough of the vitamins and minerals for that to occur.
An obvious question that I can guess the answer at, but more processed foods have lower micronutrients.
Yeah. Yes. It's the processing that removes them, but it's also because they just add fat and sugar to them. So then we fill up on calories that don't have a lot of these micronutrients.
Okay, so you mentioned the 800 gram challenge, the inverse of all that processed foods. How does the 800 gram challenge specifically contribute to our overall micronutrient need?
Yeah. And I guess I should also step back and be clear that we can get micronutrients from other foods, and even people who might, let's say, increase their whole grain intake or nuts and seeds can often see a bump in the micronutrients. So I don't want to say that it's only the 800 gram challenge, but again, because I get so often people talking about, wow, I've got this boost in energy from the 800 gram challenge, I do want to stay specific on that for just a second here. And, the 800 gram challenge of mixed fruits and veggies tends to be only about 400 calories. And 400 calories is maybe about 20% of your caloric need or less. And so we can't expect that we're going to get all of the nutrients we need from just 20% of our calories. But what we find, especially from something like fruits and vegetables, is that we can often get more than 20% of our micronutrient needs from just this 20% of our caloric need. And so I like to think about it as like your return on investment is quite high. Mm-hmm. And so what I did for fun in, nutrition geek land, is I decided to look up the most popular fruits and vegetables. And I wanted to create an 800 gram challenge of the most popular ones. And the top 4 fruits are banana, berries, and I just said, okay, let's just say it's strawberries, apples, and grapes. And then the top 4 veggies were potatoes, onions, tomato, and lettuce. And I just assumed romaine lettuce. And so what I did was I gave each one, let's just say people eat 100 grams of each of them. Now that might be a little weird. Maybe people don't do 100 grams of onions and whatever. But here we are. Let's just create an 800 gram challenge. And I used the app Chronometer because it's got good micronutrient breakdown of whatever you log in it. And I think what I liked about these popular items is I feel like they're really basic staples. I didn't pick kale and blackberries and local cherries and butternut squash. And not that anything is wrong with that, but I think people have this underlying bias against things like potatoes and onions and, banana and stuff like that. So I really liked to pull in these sources that I think people even think are less than, right? Okay, so I plugged that all in Cronometer, and no surprise, it was about 400 calories. In fact, it was 393 to be exact. So again, 20% or less than our calorie needs. And here are some of the micronutrients that are represented. You got 33% of your vitamin B3, same with vitamin B2, had about 26% of vitamin B1, 29% of vitamin B5, 85% of vitamin B6. That's a big one that's actually used in energy production, vitamin B6. 56% for folate, 70% of your vitamin A, 150% of your vitamin C, 145% of your vitamin K. And I don't want to go through all the minerals, but just a couple examples. 24% of your iron, maybe not as high as the other, but you're still getting higher than 20% of your calories. 37% of your magnesium, over a third of what you need for magnesium. Everyone's so worried about magnesium. Here it is from these measly fruits or vegetables that I chose. 77% of your potassium, right? Now, all of the vitamins were not represented here. You don't actually get any vitamin B12, for example, or vitamin D from fruits and vegetables. But again, when we look at something like, okay, we just took 400 calories, 393 of really run-of-the-mill fruits and vegetables, nothing that's exotic. And we find that they have this really good contribution to our diet in terms of that RDA, or that recommended daily allowance. And then, of course, if you imagine, well, let's play this out for a few days, people aren't only going to eat those. They're going to have some variety in their diet. We can start to get this really nice coverage across the vitamins and minerals. And so I think for a lot of people, just by increasing their fruits and vegetables consumption, they're going to see this bump in micronutrients to give them that, more energy feeling.
Got it. Okay. So we talked at the start of this a little bit about performance. You mentioned your street parking folks and early adopters or CrossFitters. Is there any, I'm sure you've come across some research that correlates this quality of diet, high in fruits and vegetables, and performance. Is that safe to assume that those things travel together?
Yeah, I think there is some research. From what I've seen, a lot of it trends a little bit towards older populations. As people age, we're specifically really concerned, are they able to live independently, and how their health is doing. And so there are stuff like stand up and sit down tests and grip strength tests, but less that I could find anyway on kind of more of a younger demographic or a more physical fit population. I did find this study from, I think it's 2020 in this show notes by Farina, and they did look at physical performance for special forces selection relative to their diet, right? So we're talking about the people who might be selected for Green Berets or something similar. So, okay, now we got a really tip of the spear population. We're not just looking at grip strength when we're 75. Nothing wrong with that, but just wanted to have a wider demographic to take a look at. Now, there's about 500 people in this study. It was an association study, so we have to remember that we can't say that what they found or what they concluded is the cause of their diet. What they did is they had these individuals fill out a questionnaire about their diet. What different types of foods do you eat? How frequently? And then they turned that into a number called the Healthy Eating Index, which is actually a numerical value that they use to look at people's diets. This isn't like a totally new thing. They use it in the USDA guidelines. But that's a way that we can effectively say, okay, whose diet is more healthy or not based on numbers. And then they took that number for these individuals and they looked at, okay, how did they perform in the physical tests that they have to go through? And then also, did they actually get selected? So not just did they perform really high, but did they actually get pulled to, I'm going to keep saying Green Berets, but it's, more than one special forces. And what they found was that people who had a higher healthy eating index performed better on the fitness test, also were faster at the loaded march times, which is essentially like the ruck, like we all know military guys do. And ultimately, yes, we're more likely to truly be selected to go on to the special forces. Now, again, it's an association study, so we can't say that definitively their quality food choices made them the better fitness person. maybe the fact that they eat healthy foods, they also have a better sleep routine. And so it's really the sleep that drove it. But nevertheless, it is this interesting association with a pretty good fitness population. And within the article, they suggest that maybe it's because of this adequate nutrition that these individuals have, not just by way of the macronutrients, but also the micronutrients that we've pointed out, that really is helping out their training and their recovery. We also looked at nitrates a while back in a podcast. And nitrates aren't micronutrients, but they are compounds that we most frequently find in vegetables. And nitrates have the ability to influence vasodilation, which is the blood vessels dilating and ultimately allowing for higher blood flow, which allows for greater amounts of delivery of oxygen, which of course is relatively important for working muscles. And so I think that's an interesting point to bring up, because there can be other compounds besides these micronutrients in foods that are helping to this better performance, which might be at play here with the Special Forces study, that, it might not just be the vitamins and minerals that are doing it, but there can be other compounds as well. I think this is why we don't really see the same effect with supplements, that we need this broad array of nutrients to improve our fitness outcomes. Yes, we need the macronutrients there, which I would say on average people are doing better, especially having plenty of carb and fat around for energy. But then we also need this slew of micronutrients. And then there also could be other compounds like the nitrates in vegetables that are helping with other processes. And so it comes back to, it's never one thing, and we want to look across a broad spectrum of nutrients that we get better from our whole diet than necessarily taking these individual pieces and trying to supplement them to excess.
Super interesting. Why aren't there more studies on the relationship between high performance and high quality diets? That seems to me to be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I probably could do more research and look for it, but I think it's hard to do. I think, one, you want to know ultimately why or what nutrient is driving performance success, because you want to be able to replicate it, and you want to be able to go to the next person and say, okay, just go take magnesium. Go take magnesium and we're going to improve your back squat. Now, as of course our listeners to this podcast know, that we don't really see a ton of these supplements play out in terms of performance. And I think it ultimately comes back to having this mixture of nutrients. But when you go to it from a study point of view, and they want to be able to take the results and go tell X, Y, and Z person, okay, this is how you're going to win your next event, it becomes much harder when it's very broad guidelines. I mean, I even know it when it's with the 800-gram challenge. One of the inevitable questions, okay, fruits and veggies, but which one is best? Okay, sure, but which one is best? And I think what people are missing is that whole foods, whole unprocessed foods, have such an array of all of the nutrients that once we start eating them with some variety and at some good volumes, we're going to cover our bases quite well. But again, from a research perspective, it's not super helpful to have these broad general guidelines, because you can't replicate it as much. You don't know, okay, when this person did the 800-gram challenge, was it the tomatoes that was really the best part? Or should they switch it up for more onions? Or do they need more potatoes? There's too many nutrients at play when we have these broad guidelines.
Got it. Okay. I'm just going to trust you then and keep eating my fruits and vegetables so I can win at the gym.
Yes. Give it a shot, right? I mean, what do you have to lose? I think it's interesting too. It's like, gosh, we'll do all this other stuff like these crazy rep schemes and, fasted workouts and all these other supplements. And instead it's like, well, just eat some fruits and veggies and see what happens.
I love it. Let's leave it there. Thank you, EC. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. Thank you for sharing the show with your friends. EC and I'll be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project Podcast.